So you built the perfect AI workflow. The client loves the demo, they're ready to pay, then they ask you the question that makes you freeze. So how do we actually use this? Do you host it? Do we host it? What about the API keys? Who maintains it? What about our privacy? And you realize you have no idea what to say. Today, I'm going to go over a 3-step framework I use for my AI engagements based on the same principles I've used over the last 12 years consulting for businesses from mid-market to Fortune 500 companies all over the world. So let's get into this. So I've broken this video down into 3 logical components. We have pre-delivery, during delivery, and post-delivery. And you'll soon find out why that's super important. So the first thing that you want to do is look at the technical validation. Now, account ownership and deployment models are something I've discussed in depth in another video. You can check it on the screen now. But it's super important that you understand it, because now that you're a consultant or a business owner, the decision stems from you, not the end client. They don't tell you, we want to manage service, or we want you to set up self-hosting for us. You decide on how you want to operate as a business, and that is how you would go about with your offer. You do this because it simplifies your life and it helps you sell things to the client, because you have one specific thing that you sell to a client. From my perspective, my favorite thing is to do a hybrid model where I get the client to self-host or use their own tools, whatever engagement I have. And then later on, I offer some form of maintenance retainer or a contract that keeps me coming back to do cost optimization, performance, and stuff like that. Super important to try and mix these things up. But I would always avoid a managed service because it's really complex to manage, especially if you have a lot of clients, and it's a massive headache. So decide on your model as early as possible and lead with that. So for the rest of this video, just assume that we're going to be going down either the self-host or hybrid route. We're not going to touch managed services. So that brings us on to point 2, which is, can they actually support the thing that you're about to implement? So regardless of what tool or build or workflow product you're trying to put in their environment, can they support it? Does their infrastructure have everything that it needs in order to run this? Have they built the environment for you? Do they have the technical staff to maintain this thing? Are you going to be working with a technical team? If not, it changes the entire way that you actually approach this engagement. And it also gives you a ton of opportunity to upsell later on, because you can train their internal team to technically enable them to manage this platform or build new platforms, things like that. So it's super important that you understand this at the beginning of the engagement, because you can make a lot more money if they have massive gaps in whatever it is that you're building for them. And then the third point is that you need to verify all of this stuff before you start. So you're going to have the overall architecture decision, like this is the tool we are here to implement. But then because you are now the architect as well, to increase your value-based pricing, you're going to be showing them what their infrastructure needs to be in order to have this tool in their environment. You're going to talk about the costs. You're going to talk about the ongoing performance. You're going to talk about the maintenance when this engagement is over. And more importantly, you're going to make sure that you bake security into what you do. You would put this in some form of documentation so that the client understands everything that they're going to get as part of this engagement. And it increases your value massively compared to someone who just comes in there and builds a tool. And then finally, just a few more points on this, because I know a lot of people ask these questions all over forums. But you need to keep in mind that if you are using a cloud-based instance, you always want to have one client per instance. Never mix your clients on one single hosting platform, because that means if somebody ever breaks into your account, they'll have access to every single one of your clients, which is a terrible thing. You don't want that. And generally, it's only going to happen if you're offering this kind of managed service, which is not really what we're discussing, but I wanted to answer this anyway. Just never share between clients, because even if you do get the security nailed, if one day you or a member of your team isn't paying attention, they can go in there and change a whole bunch of config for one client that might not have requested it, instead of doing the one that did. The second thing, if they have no technical capability on site, of course you want to offer training to get them there as fast as possible so they can manage their own platform. But in the meantime, I would always start with a cloud-based solution, because it means the maintenance, the security, and the upgrades and all of that stuff is going to be done by the cloud provider, not by the end client. So it's far easier to start. And then later on, when you've built their internal capability, you migrate them to self-hosting, which again is more money for you because of that migration. And it also means that you can then scale accordingly. So as the business grows, as they get more AI stuff, the need for the VPS might be far more apparent by then. So that's why I would always take that approach. And you need to remember that every single problem that comes up is actually an opportunity for you. So make sure that you're always listening out for problems. If you see people on site talking or moaning or complaining about something, it's an opportunity for you. It means that something can be fixed, something can be made better. Identify their problems at the start of the engagement and never stop listening, because that's how you keep upselling as you're going through. That brings us on to step number 2, which is scope and success definition. Massively important, because a lot of people get this wrong. So you need to define success up front. What does good look like to these people? Cool, we're here to implement this product for you, but how does complete look like? What does it look like when we finish this? If you don't do that up front, they're never going to know what success looks like, in which case you will never really be successful. So it's very important that you get this up front because it helps ground the expectations. Then secondly, you need to document your scope boundaries. So a lot of people, when they build a statement of work, they just include the things that are in scope. But that leaves a whole bunch of ambiguity about what could actually be in this project. So you need to make sure that you also have a whole bunch of exclusions in your statement of work as well. These are the things we're going to be doing, and we're not going to be touching these no matter if they come up or not. And that again helps ground the client expectations very early on, which means that they won't have a lot of disappointment if somewhere down the line it turns out that you're not going to do it. And then finally, change request processing. So I always have a template ready in case somebody wants to have a change process implemented. A lot of the time when you have a very solid statement of work, every time a big change needs to come through, it's more money for you because you've set the expectation up front that any large changes are not part of this project, in which case it's a new piece. So it's very easy to have just a kind of proposal that you attach to your main statement of work that says these are the proposed changes. You get them to sign off based on a fee, timeline, all of that kind of stuff. You need to make sure that you're documenting this. You need to make sure that you have this ready to go because you don't want to delay the project by having to figure all of this stuff out. So make sure you have all of this outlined because client expectations are the kind of thing that can ruin your project and your image if you don't set them early on. And then thirdly, that brings us on to data privacy and risk. And this is a massive problem at the moment because a lot of people don't actually understand the entirety of security and privacy and things like that. They're coming off of non-technical backgrounds and they're building workflows and just throwing them out there with client data. And it's massively problematic. So one of the first things that you need to do is ask them, whose data are we using? Where is it going? Are there any compliance regulations behind this? Especially if you're working in healthcare or you're doing something like that, they definitely have data processing laws that need to be understood. They definitely have regulations and compliance behind what they do. So you need to have these discussions as early as possible with the relevant teams. But then besides that, you need to understand where does the data live? Who can see it? Because if all of these people get to use your tool, that could potentially mean that some people using this thing are going to see data that they probably shouldn't. So you need to understand all of this stuff, map it out before you get started, and understand the risks involved so that you can present them clearly to the client so that they don't later on sue you or just completely destroy your image. Then next up, you need to make sure you understand the LLMs that you're using. If you're using OpenRouter or any specific LLMs, you need to understand their data processing policies. Generally, if you're going down the business or enterprise route, they're not going to be adding them to the training models. But that doesn't mean that the data doesn't traverse through their system. So again, you need to address that with your client to understand if that is going to be a problem. Because training is one thing, but still being processed. And then the second part that you need to understand about this is, okay, cool, we're going to do everything in-house. But then if you're doing it in-house, your model might not be as performant, it might cost way more, or you might not even have the capacity to build one internally. So you need to kind of weigh the pros and cons of these things and then attach that to the risk that is applied to this to make a decision that the client actually understands. And then finally, document everything. So what could go wrong? List a whole bunch of recommendations. The client decisions that overrule whatever it is that you say, you need to make sure you get that in writing. Because if you've established best practices and you've told them about the risk, the compliance issues, the security things that they should be baking in, you need to get that all in writing. Because if you just have a phone call with someone and you say to them, oh, hey, I spoke to John and he said we don't need to worry about this. Where's the evidence? That's the first thing they'll say to you, and then you will be blamed for anything going wrong. So if you remember one thing from this, always get everything in writing. And that brings us on to phase 2, which is during the delivery. Now, you need to make sure that you bake error handling into your builds, or at the very least some form of logging. Because what happens is a lot of people implement a system and they just leave it. The client assumes that everything's working as it should, but they never find out that it's not working until something goes wrong or someone can't use it when they need to. And that's the worst thing for you because that means they're going to come back to you and say, why didn't you do this in the first place? They might even lose money or time or whatever. A whole bunch of shit can go wrong. The point being, if you bake in logging and then monitor that logging, people can see what's happening with their system. But the benefit for you is that you can attach this to a maintenance contract that has you as a retainer so that you can monitor their environment, make sure things are performant, cost optimization, stuff that we do later on. So baking in the error handling actually helps you in the long term and even positions you to offer this monitoring retainer as early as possible. So lots of reasons why we do this, because without logs, we cannot see what is wrong with something. Then the next thing is to never hard code any credentials. A lot of people hard code their API keys and things like that into templatized builds, and then they hand it off to multiple clients, and these API keys are out there in the wild, and you never know what's going to go wrong. So it's super important to use credential stores. N8N has one baked into it, but there are tons of third-party ones that you can use as well. And we do this so that we don't end up in the situation where a client sues us or something horrible goes wrong. And then secondly, what you need to understand is that having a staging environment is mandatory. So if I'm building something for a client, I'll do it all on my laptop because that means I can get the POC done as fast as possible. I'm never going to break anything. But once I'm done proving the concept, I'm going to bring it into their environment. Ideally first a test environment or just one aspect of their business. And then I'll slowly but surely expand into production when I see how it's responding to their data and in their environment. And it's super important that you take this staggered approach because you don't just want to go into production without knowing what could happen. And then finally, you want to make sure that you have some form of version control or dated backups, just so that you can roll back if anything goes wrong and you don't have to massively redo everything. I've seen this happen a ton of times to people, so make sure that you actually follow this. And then finally, document as you build. A lot of people prefer to document everything right at the end, but the problem with doing that is that you often miss a lot of the context that you have when you're actually building this thing. Say I'm building a workflow and I see error 123 regularly happens. Of course, I'm going to go and fix it, but that doesn't mean that it is removed forever. You find a pattern that happens with specific errors and you document them as part of your troubleshooting guide. So the benefit for this is that when you leave site and you hand over all this amazing documentation, you have a guide that people can follow in case the specific error happens. And this brings us on to point number 2, which is client management, arguably the most important part of this video, because without managing your clients correctly, your engagement is going to end up a failure. So as we spoke about in the beginning of this video, we set the expectations early on. The statement of work does it, the scoping does it. We show them what they're going to get out of this, and we look at the definition of success. Great start. But then throughout your engagement, you need to make sure that you're doing things properly. And it starts with showing progress continuously. So if I'm going to a client, I'm going to have regular check-ins. That's why there are stand-ups. So we can talk about what's happening with the project or maybe show any wins that we've had very early. But when you're building something custom for a client, it's really important that you work with them to some degree, because their perception or their idea of whatever it is that they want might be completely different to yours, especially if you didn't understand them properly. So if you spend 10 days building them something and it turns out to be the exact opposite of what they actually wanted, you're screwed. So it's really good to work with these people in chunks to show them, is this what you wanted? Is this dashboard the way that it should be? Is this tool running the way you expected it to? Little things like that show them that you're paying attention to whatever it is that they want and trying to build them the perfect machine. Then second, you need to test with them using their data. Massive mistake to keep everything on your laptop and test with your own dummy data and then just throw it straight into production. Always use the client's data and always run it with them, because then they get to test things early on as they're running through it. But more importantly than anything, the data is the most important part of this. You don't just want to use your dummy data and then throw something into production. And then finally on this, manage the expectations early. We did that in phase 1. We set our expectations, but make sure that you never overpromise something and then underdeliver. Don't promise them the world and then just give them a tiny piece of it. That's the worst way to set yourself up for failure. A few other rules on this is to keep the ball in their court. If you're going through a project, you're going to be updating them, as we just spoke about, but make sure that you never ever leave them sitting there wondering what the hell it is that you're doing. So we give the updates, but if something goes wrong, the ball is always in their court. You've updated them and now you're waiting on them. That's how it should be. Set your expectations and you manage the expectations properly. And then finally on this, you need scope protection. So we spoke about scoping in the beginning, and this is how it all ties in together. So phase 2 is your new best friend. If people ask for big changes and they kind of expect them for free, you say that's a great idea. We should implement that in phase 2. And that's how you get on your discussion of coming back to the statement of work, talking about phase 2, and then you hand them that change proposal. The point is that you always want to separate it or make a clear boundary between what you're doing now and what an upgraded change would look like as part of a separate proposal. You also want to make sure, as I just mentioned, that you want to document and escalate any blockers. The ball needs to be in their court. Any technical decisions or problems that you're waiting on, it stands with the client and not you. Never sit there thinking that the client is going to be okay with not knowing what's going on. It's important to keep them updated. More importantly, to protect yourself and your image, to make sure that you're on top of this. And then finally, know your walkaway point. So if you've set the expectations clearly up front and everything is going well, but then they turn around and they say to you, oh, we want this done. And you say, well, we can't do that. It's not in the statement of work, so we're going to have to talk about this in phase 2. And they're like, no, we want it in phase 1. If they start to become unreasonable like that, then you need to have a plan to say, you're no longer worth working with, I'm going to go. Obviously not in those words, but you get the point I'm trying to make here. And that brings us on to phase 3, which is the post-delivery. Now, you need to make sure that you have the best handoff as possible because, again, this ties into the user adoption and how people experience your product. So you want to have hands-on training until it's proven. What a lot of people do is they'll have a workshop before they leave, ask any questions, you guys understand this? Cool, I'm going. That's the worst thing to do. You need to make sure that you do the workshop, but then you get them to do the thing on the workshop as well, because that helps you train them to experience the product with you there. And then they'll find out if there are any problems in their workflows and things like that, so that you can simulate this as fast as possible and iron out any kinks. The point of this is to get them to adopt the product, to make sure that their user experience is amazing and so that they actually give you a good review. Then next up, you've got complete documentation package. Now, a lot of people, again, they just leave written documentation, which is kind of okay, especially if you've written a run book that is so clear a 3-year-old can understand it. But what I like to do is include videos. I might even include a recorded workshop. The point is that I'm going to have something more interactive, something that they can watch and actually experience a recording of me running through the entire thing that I built for them so that they can see how it works. They can refer back to it if they're ever troubleshooting something, stuff like that. And it's super easy to do. Just record a loom and include it in your documentation when you hand it over. And then finally, acceptance sign-off. This is obvious for most people, but when you're wrapping up on a call, you want to make sure that you get sign-off from the client. Yes, we love your product, blah, 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 blah. When you get off the call, you follow up with an email saying how great it was to work with them, and you make sure that they respond saying something similar so that you actually have sign-off from them on completion of the project. We have now met the definition of done. Next up, we have maintenance clarity. Now, hopefully this was something you baked into your engagement early on, where you defined what the maintenance retainer would look like. But for the most part, whenever you're building something for a client, whether you charge for this specific point or not, is entirely up to you. What a lot of people do is they include 30 days of warranty for bugs. So you would have a very clear definition of what a bug is. You would define that and make sure that you include some form of support for it. Pretty straightforward. Anything larger than that is a different fee. You would also have documented whose responsibility it is to handle the platform updates, take care of security patches, API deprecations, AI model changes, things like that. So either you would have trained their internal team to take care of this, or you would have clearly documented how you take care of this as part of your retainer model. And then finally, you would have your retainer options with clear pricing. So generally it might be 3 tiers on a subscription model or something like that, and each one offers something better than the previous model. Pretty straightforward. I have an entire video on that if you want to check out what maintenance looks like and how you can price that and things like that, because it really is a lucrative part of all of this. A lot of people go in there and they want to build something new, but from my experience over the last 12 years, most of the money I made was in fixing broken things for massive enterprises. So make sure you check out my video. And then finally on this, we have growth and long-term value. Now, it's important that you do this as early as possible. Again, you document your wins, you build your case study as you go along, because this helps upsell you when you're in the company. So you want to make sure that you stay visible without being needy. Even after the engagement is finished, there are more opportunities for you in the future. You just need to make sure that they don't forget who you are, even if they didn't choose that retainer model that you offered. And then finally, remember that expansion comes from being present. If you found these things at the beginning of your engagement, these problems that we spoke about, you can bring them up at the end of your engagement. If you didn't have an opportunity to do it before, when you're about to sign off and say goodbye to everyone, say, did you guys ever solve that problem that we spoke about earlier? And then it will get them thinking about it again. And if they didn't solve it, that's a whole new discovery call for you and the process starts all over again. So that's why it's super important to always make sure that you're listening for new opportunities on site. And that's it for this video, guys. I hope you found some value. Leave some comments below. Otherwise, check the videos on the screen right now. They're definitely going to help you on your journey. And I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.